Thanks very much, Ceann Comhairle. I may not take my full time, and I'd have to say, I suppose, first out, I'm absolutely delighted that this bill has been tabled. You know, people often give out, and correctly so, about politicians, but at least we have to go before the people once in a blue moon, and there is some element of accountability and right to recall, whereas the reality is, with the judiciary in this state, they are completely and utterly a law unto themselves. I think within that it's actually great that so many of them perform so well, but those who don't, we're absolutely stuck with. So while I'm very glad that Fianna Fáil have introduced this bill, I think the measures proposed in it will go some way to improving the judges that we end up with. The idea that somebody could be in such a position of power because of political connections rather than necessarily merit and so on is absolutely reprehensible, and I do welcome those measures. But I think we really need to put the spotlight on this issue. It's actually critical that there needs to be substantial reform in this area. The lack of training and regulation of judges is a huge problem, and when they behave irrationally at the moment, there's absolutely nothing that can be done. So the idea of justice not only being done but being seen to be done cannot happen in our state while the judiciary are organised in the manner in which they are at the moment. And I want to take the time to maybe tell a story, and I would reassure you, Cathaoirleach, that this story, even though it involves a court case, will not go into any details about the court case that was actually in front of the judge itself. But I think it gives a graphic example of what I'm talking about. And it's incredibly fresh in my mind because it happened today and it involves me. And it involves the District Court Justice in Naas District Court. Now, the history of this event is that I was summoned to appear before Naas District Court for a driving offence, for driving at a speed of 59 kilometres per hour, allegedly, in a 50-kilometre zone. Now, 3 weeks ago, I was called in relation to that case. The case was not listed for a hearing on that date. It was the first mention in court. When I arrived in court, the case was number 188 on the court list. And the judge in that case, who's well known in the area for whatever reason, not judicial proceedings on time, even though the court is scheduled to start at 10:30, he regularly appears much later than that. But in any case, has a tradition in that area of the cases being religiously done in order. So in every other case and court I've ever been in as an observer or a defender or prosecutor or whatever, the judges would normally go through a list, dispense with the cases that are just there seeking a court date, keep back the ones that are there for a hearing in order to efficiently administer justice and have a timely management of all of the people who end up in that court that day. The people who take off work to attend because they've been summoned as witnesses or as defence people, all of the solicitors, all of the guards, all of the prison officers and so on. So my case was listed 188 out of 188, and the judge proceeded with the cases for the morning, and I watched what had happened in those cases. I instructed a solicitor on this minor driving matter and left the court at lunchtime. Now, later in that day, while I was attending the committee, I wasn't to know that the judge, having reached case number 175, and I am, Ceann Comhairle, because it relates to the fact that judges are not subject to any accountability whatsoever, and the huge costs that they can incur to the state by their irrational behaviour. So what happened in this case was, when the judge was finishing up for the day, got to case number 175 and decided he'd jump the list and go to 188, bring the solicitor before the court and ask him where was his client and why was his client not there, even though I had instructed a solicitor, and what reason did I have. And of course the reason that I had for not being there was that I'd been there in the morning, I'd watched how this judge had dealt with the cases that were there before me, saw cases where people did not turn up on similar charges, did not have a solicitor in similar charges, and no bench warrants or any proceedings were dealt with. A judgment was simply given in those cases. So The point I'm making is judges are in an incredibly powerful position. I respect our court system and I respect the fact that judges have discretion, but that discretion has to be exercised proportionately and rationally. And when it is not, there has to be somebody there that calls that to account. Because while that judge can accuse me, without any recall on my part, of disrespecting the court, in reality to me, by doing that and issuing a bench warrant in those circumstances when I clearly wasn't any risk of absconding, the case wasn't even listed for a hearing, and he dealt with loads of other cases earlier where he never issued a bench warrant and the people weren't even there at all or didn't have a solicitor, the consequence of his action was that, first of all, on Garda Síochána, who were actually innocent victims in this situation, were subject to massive negative publicity that they'd orchestrated the situation. A sergeant had to leave his post in Newbridge, spend the day in Swords Court vacating that order with a squad car with him at enormous expense to the state. And I had to go back there today to listen to the same judge lecturing me about disrespecting his court, not giving me an opportunity to say anything about his irrational decisions, but at the same time carrying on. Now, I know that our laws at the moment say that nobody can do anything about that judge, but he's causing huge problems with regard to the administration of justice and the inefficiency of the court operation in that area. So this is an area which needs radical reform, and I really am very glad that Fianna Fáil opted to move it today, because it's long overdue. It's only an aspect of it. We need to go further and look at this whole area. And I know it's on the government's programme to have a judicial council, but some outrageous decisions and behaviour is taking place in our courts by the judiciary. And in fairness, the President of the District Court or the Circuit Court or so on can do nothing about it unless it's a court of law, and we cannot have that situation continuing. I could go on, Chair. I know there are other areas where judges have been appointed to areas where maybe they worked as a solicitor in the same community, so potentially in a place of conflict, whereby on the one hand they are now judging people who they may be formally represented and have continued on with those cases, which is completely wrong. And I don't think the option of challenging judges through a judicial review is sufficient, because you're putting yourself in a position, firstly, of massive expense, but also the position of basically accusing a judge of bias, which people don't want to do for fear of whatever. So, look, I know other people have probably made points about some really inconsistent decisions that have been made, some awful consequences, far more than mine, but I really just wanted to use that as an example of how utterly ludicrous some of the behaviour that people we have entrusted to manage our courts is, and no one can do anything about it. And the saddest thing about that case is that that judge is the sitting judge in Naas District Court, which means he can stay there for as long as he likes. And from looking at him today, yeah, he's a few years left in him. They could have him now for, I'd say, about 12 years. And the expense to the state of having every day maybe 100 guards, solicitors, people tied up while he operates his court list like that, and no one can say anything to him, is utterly ludicrous and in radical need of change. So I actually support this bill as a first step in that process.